Pregnancy survival mode. The second trimester brought challenges that tested every limit I thought I had as a husband. My wife's pregnancy symptoms intensified dramatically, and with them came a series of demands that required me to develop organizational skills I never knew I possessed. She would wake me at 2 in the morning with urgent cravings that seemed designed to test my dedication to her comfort. One night she desperately needed dill pickles covered in vanilla ice cream, so I drove to 3 different convenience stores until I found the exact brand she remembered from childhood. Her request became so wild I started a spreadsheet to keep up with which stores carried unusual items and their operating hours. These middle-of-the-night missions became routine as her cravings evolved into increasingly complex combinations that required food preparation skills I had never developed. The emotional demands proved even more exhausting than the grocery runs. Her mood swings became so unpredictable that I learned to read her facial expressions like weather patterns. One evening I came home from work to find her crying over a commercial featuring puppies. When I tried to comfort her by suggesting we watch something else, she exploded at me for not understanding that the puppies reminded her of the babies and how overwhelmed she felt about managing 2 infants. I spent the next hour walking on eggshells, afraid that any comment might trigger another emotional storm. Sandra became my lifeline during this period of intense pregnancy management. She would call me regularly to check on how I was handling the stress and offer practical advice about supporting a pregnant wife carrying twins. When I told her about the bizarre food cravings and middle-of-the-night grocery runs, she would laugh knowingly and share stories about her own pregnancy experiences decades earlier. Her understanding made me feel less alone in navigating these difficult months. More importantly, Sandra started actively defending me when my wife was being particularly unreasonable about my efforts to help her. During family dinners, if my wife would criticize me for bringing the wrong type of crackers or not anticipating her needs quickly enough, Sandra would gently point out how much I was doing to support the pregnancy. She would remind my wife that I was working full-time while also handling most household responsibilities and managing her constant requests for special accommodations. These moments of having someone take my side felt incredible after months of feeling like nothing I did was adequate or appreciated. Sandra would tell my wife that she was lucky to have such a devoted husband who never complained about the extra work the pregnancy created. When my wife would dismiss these comments or argue that I was just doing what any husband should do, Sandra would defend me more forcefully, pointing out that many men would not handle pregnancy demands with the patience I showed every day. The tension between mother and daughter began escalating as Sandra became more vocal about supporting me through the pregnancy challenges. My wife started accusing her mother of taking my side in disagreements and not understanding how difficult pregnancy was for the woman actually carrying the babies. Sandra would respond that she understood pregnancy perfectly well since she had experienced it herself, and that pregnancy was not an excuse for treating a supportive husband poorly. These arguments usually ended with my wife storming out of Sandra's house or hanging up the phone, leaving me in the awkward position of being the cause of conflict between them while also being grateful that someone was finally acknowledging how hard I was working to be a good husband and future father. Sandra would apologize to me for the family drama while reassuring me that I was doing everything right and that my wife's behavior was not my fault. As the pregnancy progressed into the 3rd trimester, my reliance on Sandra's emotional support became something I looked forward to more than time spent with my own wife. When my wife would have particularly difficult days filled with complaints and unreasonable demands, I would call Sandra to vent my frustrations and receive the encouragement I needed to continue being patient. She would listen to my concerns without judgment and remind me that this phase would eventually end once the babies were born. Sandra also provided practical help that made managing the pregnancy demands much easier. She would come over to cook meals when my wife was too uncomfortable to eat normal food, and she knew how to prepare the exact combinations my wife craved without needing detailed instructions. She would clean our house when I was too exhausted from work and pregnancy duties to keep up with household maintenance, and she never made me feel guilty about needing this assistance. The growing emotional connection between Sandra and me during this period created a dynamic that felt more supportive than my relationship with my wife had become. Sandra appreciated my efforts in ways that my wife took for granted, and she provided encouragement and validation that I was not receiving at home. When I would express doubts about whether I was handling the pregnancy stress properly, Sandra would reassure me that I was being an exceptional husband and that any woman would be grateful for the level of care I was providing. By the final weeks of pregnancy, I was spending more emotional energy on conversations with Sandra than on interactions with my wife. Sandra wanted to hear about every doctor appointment and every new development with the babies, while my wife treated these updates as routine medical information. The contrast in their levels of interest made me feel more connected to Sandra than to the woman actually carrying our children. As my wife's due date approached, I convinced myself that once the babies arrived, everything would change for the better. The stress of pregnancy would be over and we could focus on being parents together. I had no idea that the real test of our family was just beginning. Twin chaos and family meltdown. When the twins finally arrived after what felt like the longest labor in medical history, I thought the hard part was behind us. I imagined those peaceful moments you see in movies where new parents gaze lovingly at their sleeping babies while soft music plays in the background. Instead, I discovered that newborn twins operate on some kind of supernatural schedule, designed to ensure that at least one of them is awake and demanding attention every single moment of every single day. They took turns sleeping for an entire month, creating this relentless cycle where just as I would get one baby settled and quiet, the other would wake up screaming for food or a diaper change, or just to make sure we remembered they existed. The sleep deprivation hit our household like a freight train carrying exhaustion and confusion. I would stumble through my morning routine after getting maybe 2 hours of broken sleep, trying to remember basic tasks like brushing my teeth or finding matching socks. My wife was getting even less rest than I was since she was breastfeeding both babies, which meant she was up every few hours around the clock. The dark circles under her eyes made her look like she had been in a boxing match, and her emotional state became increasingly fragile as the weeks of interrupted sleep accumulated. My wife's postpartum experience was nothing like the gentle recovery period I had imagined during pregnancy. She became extremely nervous and irritable, snapping at me for minor things like loading the dishwasher wrong or not anticipating which baby would need attention next. She would cry without warning while holding one of the twins, saying she felt like nothing more than a food source for two demanding creatures who gave nothing back except dirty diapers and endless crying. Her confidence as a new mother seemed to disappear completely as she struggled with the overwhelming responsibility of caring for two infants simultaneously. My coworkers thought I had moved in at the office because work had never felt so peaceful. I could drink a cup of coffee while it was still hot and have conversations with adults who used complete sentences and logical thinking. I could eat lunch without someone screaming for attention or needing an immediate diaper change. 8 hours of spreadsheets and meetings had become my daily escape from the battlefield that our home had turned into. Sandra moved into our house during this period, taking extended leave from her job to help us manage the twin crisis that had overwhelmed our household. Her arrival brought the first sense of calm and organization we had experienced since bringing the babies home from the hospital. The contrast between Sandra's competence and the rest of our family's complete breakdown became obvious within days of her moving in. While my wife and I stumbled around like zombies trying to remember basic parenting tasks, Sandra maintained this steady, capable presence that made everything seem manageable. However, Sandra's presence also created new tensions between her and my wife that added another layer of stress to our already chaotic household. My wife would get defensive when Sandra would gently suggest different approaches to feeding or sleeping schedules, interpreting her mother's help as criticism of her parenting abilities. When Sandra would successfully calm a baby that my wife had been struggling with for 20 minutes, instead of feeling grateful for the assistance, my wife would become more frustrated and question why she could not handle her own children as well as her mother could. These conflicts between mother and daughter often erupted into arguments about the proper way to handle various baby care situations. My wife would insist that she wanted to figure things out herself, while Sandra would point out that accepting help was not a sign of failure but a practical necessity when dealing with twins. I found myself caught in the middle of these disputes, trying to keep the peace while secretly feeling grateful that Sandra was there to provide the stability and expertise that neither my wife nor I possessed during those overwhelming first months. As the twins grew older and more mobile, our house transformed into what I can only describe as a wildlife preserve where I served as the primary zookeeper. One morning, I discovered one twin had somehow managed to put something in the toilet while the other had decided to wash their hands in that same toilet water. Another day, I found one baby systematically removing every book from our bookshelf while the other had figured out how to open the kitchen cabinets and was distributing pots and pans across the floor like some kind of musical instrument experiment. Through all of these daily catastrophes, Sandra remained the one constant source of calm and practical solutions in our household. She never seemed surprised by the creative ways the twins found to cause trouble, and she always had strategies for managing their behavior that actually worked. When I would feel completely overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping two active toddlers safe and entertained, Sandra would step in with activities that captured their attention and gave me a chance to catch my breath. Her competence in handling the twin chaos made me realize how much I had come to depend on her presence in our home. She anticipated problems before they happened, knew how to prevent tantrums before they started, and somehow managed to maintain her sense of humor even during the most stressful moments of managing our expanded household. While my wife struggled with the demands of motherhood and I felt like I was barely keeping my head above water, Sandra made everything look effortless and manageable. The growing admiration I felt for Sandra's strength and capability during this period created feelings that went beyond simple gratitude for her help with the babies. As the months passed and the twins became more independent, I began to notice that our family was developing patterns that none of us had anticipated when we first brought the babies home from the hospital. When work became the escape. The most significant change came when my wife decided to return to work, claiming she needed adult interaction and professional challenges to feel like herself again. Within weeks, she was volunteering for every overtime assignment and business trip available, timing her arrivals home to coincide with the twins being asleep, and avoiding the chaos of active toddler management entirely. Around the same time, my company offered me the option to work remotely, which seemed like perfect timing given our childcare situation. I transitioned to handling my job responsibilities from home while simultaneously becoming the primary caregiver for two energetic toddlers who had recently discovered the joy of walking and climbing on everything in our house. My daily routine became a complex juggling act between conference calls and diaper changes, between client presentations and preventing the twins from injuring themselves on household furniture. Working from home with twin toddlers required me to develop multitasking skills that I never knew existed. I would conduct important business meetings while one child sat on my lap and the other played quietly with toys at my feet. During phone calls with clients, I learned to mute myself quickly when one of the twins would start crying, or when they would begin one of their frequent disagreements over sharing toys. My home office became a child-proofed workspace where every sharp corner was covered and every electrical cord was hidden behind safety barriers. Sandra became my daily companion and co-parent during this period, spending her days at our house helping me manage the impossible task of working full-time while caring for two active children. She would arrive each morning around 8 with fresh coffee and a plan for keeping the twins entertained while I handled my most important work responsibilities. Her presence made the difference between barely surviving each day and actually maintaining some level of professional competence in my job. Our teamwork became so seamless we developed secret twin survival code words. When one of us would say "tornado warning," the other would immediately know that both children were having simultaneous meltdowns and we needed to divide and conquer. Code red meant someone had gotten into something they should not have touched, and naptime miracle was our celebration phrase when both twins actually fell asleep at the same time. These private signals created a partnership that functioned more smoothly than any parenting arrangement I had imagined possible. Sandra would handle morning breakfast and getting the children dressed while I prepared for my first conference calls of the day. During my lunch breaks, we would work together to feed the twins and get them down for their afternoon naps, which gave me quiet time to focus on detailed work projects that required concentration. The efficiency of our coordination created moments of genuine humor that brightened even the most chaotic days. When one twin would have a complete meltdown over something trivial like the wrong color sippy cup, Sandra and I would exchange knowing looks and seamlessly switch roles, so that whoever was handling the situation could step back and let the other person try a different approach. We developed a system of nonverbal communication that allowed us to coordinate responses to twin emergencies without having to discuss strategy in front of crying children. Our shared experiences created inside jokes and references that my wife was never part of since she was rarely home during the hours when these memorable moments happened. When Sandra would mention the incident with the twins and the peanut butter sandwich that somehow ended up smeared across 3 different rooms, I would start laughing before she finished the sentence because I had been there to witness the entire disaster unfold. These shared memories became a private language between us that excluded my wife from understanding the daily reality of managing our household. The unintended intimacy of this shared humor created something deeper than simple partnership in childcare duties. We would catch each other's eyes during particularly absurd moments and communicate entire conversations through facial expressions alone. When both twins would simultaneously decide they needed different things at exactly the same moment, Sandra and I would look at each other with expressions that said, "Here we go again," and somehow find the energy to handle whatever crisis was unfolding. During quiet moments when the twins were napping, Sandra and I would sit together having tea and discussing everything from current events to memories from our respective childhoods. These conversations felt more intimate and meaningful than most of the interactions I had with my wife during her brief appearances at home. Sandra would ask thoughtful questions about my work projects and remember details from previous discussions, showing the kind of genuine interest that I had stopped expecting from my wife. Contrast between Sandra's presence and involvement in our daily life versus my wife's calculated absence became impossible to ignore. When the twins would accomplish new developmental milestones like saying new words or learning to use utensils, Sandra would be there to witness and celebrate these moments with me. My wife would hear about these achievements secondhand when I would mention them during our brief conversations before bed, and her responses felt polite rather than genuinely excited. My growing emotional dependence on Sandra's presence and support began affecting how I structured my days and planned my schedule. When she would mention needing to run errands or visit friends, I would feel genuinely anxious about managing the twins alone for several hours. Her steady, capable energy had become something I relied on not just for practical help with childcare, but for emotional stability and companionship during the long days of remote work and parenting responsibilities. The realization that I looked forward to Sandra's company more than my wife's increasingly rare appearances at home created feelings that went beyond simple gratitude for her assistance with the children. Sandra understood the rhythm of our household in ways that my wife had never bothered to learn, and she anticipated needs and problems before they became crises. Her competence and reliability made me feel supported and appreciated in ways that my marriage had never provided. As months passed with this arrangement, I began noticing things about Sandra that had nothing to do with her role as grandmother and household helper. The way she moved around our kitchen preparing meals, the sound of her laughter when the twins did something particularly amusing, the comfortable silence we shared during evening hours after the children were asleep. These small observations were accumulating into something that should have concerned me more than it did. Dangerous territory. The change in how I perceived Sandra happened so gradually that I barely noticed it was occurring until the feelings had already taken root. What started as appreciation for her help with the children slowly transformed into something much more complicated and inappropriate. I began noticing details about her that had nothing to do with her role as grandmother or household helper. The way she moved around our kitchen while preparing meals caught my attention in ways that made me feel like I was betraying my marriage just by observing her daily activities. Her presence became something I found myself seeking out during our shared moments in the house. When she would lean over to help one of the twins with their breakfast, I would find myself drawn to be nearby, finding excuses to linger in the kitchen when she was cooking or organizing the children's toys. These moments brought us into closer proximity in ways that felt both natural and dangerously inappropriate. The way she carried herself began capturing my attention in ways that made me feel guilty and confused about my motivations for spending time in the same rooms where she was working. When she would move through our house with that confident energy she brought to everything, I found myself watching her in ways that crossed the boundaries of appropriate family relationships. I would catch myself staring and then quickly look away, hoping she had not noticed my inappropriate attention. My behavior around Sandra began resembling that of an awkward teenager dealing with his first serious crush. I would find myself tongue-tied during conversations that had previously felt natural and comfortable. When she would ask me simple questions about the children's schedules or household needs, I would stumble over my words and give unnecessarily complicated answers to straightforward inquiries. The confidence I had developed in our daily partnership disappeared, replaced by nervous energy that made me second-guess every interaction we had throughout the day. The shared responsibilities of managing our household had created emotional closeness that made these feelings feel like natural progressions rather than shocking betrayals of family boundaries. We had developed routines and communication patterns that resembled those of a married couple more than in-laws sharing childcare duties. When one of the twins would have a crisis, Sandra and I would respond as a unified team, anticipating each other's actions and supporting each other's decisions in ways that felt intimate and connected. Our daily experiences raising the children together had created shared memories and inside jokes that excluded my wife from understanding the bond Sandra and I had developed. When Sandra would reference something funny that had happened during the day, I would immediately know what she meant and respond with the same level of amusement she felt about the situation. These moments of perfect understanding and shared humor made me feel more emotionally connected to her than I had felt to my wife in years. Small moments of accidental contact began taking on meaning that went far beyond normal family interactions. When our hands would brush while we were both reaching for the same item, the brief contact would remind me how long it had been since my wife had shown any physical affection or interest in maintaining intimacy in our marriage. These innocent touches would linger in my mind longer than they should have, creating awareness that made me question my loyalty to my marriage. My wife's continued emotional absence from our household made the situation with Sandra feel less like betrayal and more like finding the companionship and appreciation I had been missing in my marriage. Sandra was present for all the small moments that make up daily family life, while my wife remained focused on her work responsibilities and avoided the intimacy of shared parenting experiences. The contrast made my growing feelings for Sandra seem reasonable rather than inappropriate. The internal struggle between guilt and desire created constant tension in my thoughts and behavior throughout each day. I knew that developing romantic feelings for my mother-in-law violated every boundary of appropriate family relationships, but I also could not deny that Sandra provided emotional support and understanding that my wife had never offered during our entire marriage. This conflict between what I knew was right and what I felt was natural created a state of emotional turmoil that affected how I handled even routine interactions with both women. Living in the same house with Sandra while experiencing these inappropriate feelings created an atmosphere of unspoken tension that seemed to charge every casual conversation with meaning that went far beyond normal family interactions. When she would pass by me in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and living room, I would find myself hyper-aware of her presence in ways that reminded me of the emotional void in my relationship with my wife. Sandra's own responses to these moments suggested that she was experiencing similar awareness of the changing dynamic between us. She would linger slightly longer than necessary during our conversations, and her eye contact became more intense and meaningful than the casual interactions we had shared during her first months living with us. The way she would laugh at my jokes or remember small details about my work projects felt different from simple politeness or family courtesy. The growing recognition that these feelings might be mutual made the situation both more exciting and more dangerous. We had developed this careful dance around each other, maintaining the appearance of normal family relationships while both of us seemed increasingly aware that something had shifted between us. Every shared glance during dinner conversations or moment of teamwork with the children carried undertones that neither of us was acknowledging out loud. I found myself looking forward to our daily interactions in ways that had nothing to do with childcare responsibilities or household management. The anticipation of seeing Sandra each morning became something I thought about before falling asleep at night. When she would mention plans to visit friends or run errands that would take her away from our house for several hours, I would feel genuinely disappointed about spending the day without her company. The situation was approaching a point where someone would need to acknowledge what was developing between us. The unspoken tension was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day, and I could sense that we were both struggling to maintain the pretense that nothing had changed in our relationship. Something was building toward a moment of truth that would force us to confront these inappropriate feelings we had been dancing around for weeks.